Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. I am Kaylee Bateman, the Content Director at She Can Code, and I have the wonderful Linda Dotz, Chief Partner Strategy Officer at SS&C Blue Prism with me today. Linda, you have the honour of being our first guest on our new podcast, and what better than to start the series with a discussion about cracking the glass ceiling, being a female leader in technology. Hi, Linda, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. And I am very excited to be your first guest.
Yes, we're excited to have you. And what a topic as well, because it's no secret that there is a lack of women in the tech sector. Currently, women make up just 19% of the tech workforce in the UK. In the States, this figure is a little better at 26.7%. In the US, women in tech hold less than 28% of the leadership positions. And according to a report from PwC, women in the UK make up only 5% of leadership positions. So before we cover those depressing numbers, Linda, we would love to hear a little bit about you and your journey so far. So tell us, how did you get into the technology sector?
Well, I've been in the tech sector for quite a long time. So in the early days, I actually followed my father's footsteps, which I know probably in these days not too many people do, but he worked for AT&T, which was a very large employer in the US. And I started in AT&T based on his bosses, who was our general manager at the time, recommendation of becoming a systems engineer. And he recommended that to me because he said, if you learn the details of how the products work, how customers implement those products, et cetera, you'll be the best salesperson ever. So I wanted to be in sales, but he suggested I start as a systems engineer and really understand what it takes in those days to bring telecommunications into a customer's business. So I took that advice and have been very happy in the tech sector ever since.
Fabulous. I'm pleased that you don't have any regrets having having joined. And as you mentioned, you've been in it for a very long time, and you must have seen quite a change for women in particular. But what do you think is the key to success in the tech industry? I mean, I suppose whether you're male or female.
I think whether it be in the tech industry or other industries, there's one real key to success, and especially for women who are not necessarily surrounded by their peers in the roles that they aspire to. And I believe the most important thing you can do, especially in the tech sector, is that first piece of advice I got, which was make sure you are the subject matter expert at what you do. Be the smartest person in the room at what you do. And then secondly, be the person you aspire to. So look at the person within the organization, male or female, it really doesn't matter. And see what they do, how they act, what they've done to be successful, and be that person. Because as people see you in that way, then they will take you to that next level. And that's really, in the tech space especially, very important for women that want to lead in the tech space. So 2 pieces of advice: be the best that you can be at what you do, be the subject matter expert. And then secondly, look at the person or people that you aspire to in the roles that you want to get to and act in that way.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of a piece of advice I was given years ago about, as you mentioned, they're looking to the person or the position where you would like to be. And somebody said to me about dressing for that position as well. And even, back in the day when we were in the office, but just remembering to almost dress as if you're in that position already. Because when you go to meetings, you're already set for that role. And I remember somebody telling me that years ago. So you're absolutely right. They're having that next position in mind and where you're going to go.
I had a mentor at one point, and she was a female mentor. She was my boss at the time, and she was a vice president in a pretty large company. And I had just had my 2 children, and my children are only 15 months apart. So you can imagine that was quite a busy time.
Yes.
And we were still relatively young. We didn't have a whole lot of money, especially with the babies coming along so quickly. And she actually hired a professional for me, took me into New York City to Saks Fifth Avenue, bought me a new wardrobe. And I spent about $5,000 in those days. That was a lot of money for me to spend on clothes.
Yeah.
But to your point, that's exactly what she was doing. She said, this is a pivotal time in your career. You're either going to stay, kind of somewhere in that middle layer of management that you are, or you're going to achieve much greater things, because I know you can. And so having me get together with that personal shopper and have her take me into the city and just, pick out the wardrobe that I needed to have to be that person, of where I wanted to go. That's a personal memory I will never forget.
Oh, wow. I bet that was a great day. But yeah, it would have got you in the mindset of where you want to be. And then when people see you dressed that way, they already see you in that role. So it's it's just natural to promote you into that role in the future. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned, at the start that you've been in tech for some time. The industry must have changed, dramatically. You must have seen dramatic changes. How do you think it's changed for women since you started in tech?
I think there's a couple different ways. First and foremost, there's so many programs, within colleges, within just within the businesses themselves, that have now understood the value of having a very diverse workforce. And a couple of examples in the U.S., and this may be in some ways why we've progressed a bit faster than the UK, given the stats you mentioned earlier. Goldman Sachs, as an example, had put out a statement not too long ago, maybe 5 or so years ago, that they would not invest in startups that didn't have women at least one woman on their board of directors. That's a very strong statement,
Yes.
for startup tech companies, and obviously tech, in the US for many, many years has equaled Silicon Valley. So it was a strong statement to the companies that either were trying to raise funds in the Valley or were trying to grow, right, their presence and the size of their companies. That this was an important thing to do, to have diversity within your board of directors, the people that are actually guiding the company, making the decisions for the company. The other thing that we've seen now, even more recently, is women with substantial investment funds that are making decisions to take that money and invest it in either startup companies or growth companies that are women-led. And that's been a very important aspect, I think, of the next phase of growth, that these companies get the investment that they need to deliver on both the portfolios and products and services that they bring to their customer base, but also have the wherewithal to make sure that they have the right people in their business to make them successful. So I think those are a couple things that have really made a difference. And, one a little bit earlier on, one much more recently. But then,
yeah. And as you mentioned, though, there are companies are making a difference. There are great initiatives. As you mentioned, that there have been some big changes. But why do you think there is still so few females in technology? Is there something about the sector that is still not drawing women in? Is it putting them off, or are they coming in and leaving?
I think it's a mix. We're seeing much more traction now for, I think, a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we have a lot more flexibility in the way we work. Like my story, I had two small children, very close together. And quite honestly, it would have been hard in those early days if my husband had not decided to be the stay-at-home dad with my daughters. Because in those days you had to show up every day for work. You had to be there on time, right? It was not the virtual type workforce that we have today. And so I was very fortunate in that he made that decision. But in the early days, many women had to make a choice. They had to make a choice, either stay home with their children or find a caregiver, but that wasn't as popular in those early days. Now with the virtual workforce, and especially what we've seen, it started actually with 9/11 in the US, when companies had to say, I have to have a way for my workforce to be remote. And then post that, you had some companies that decided that they were going to have a fully remote workforce, right? So you had the kind of extremes. And now more recently with COVID, it became very clear to us again that with all the technology that enables a remote workforce, and with some of the policies that companies have taken on, it's very possible for people to have much more flexibility in the way they work, yet still be able to perform the role as you need it to be performed. I mentioned to you a bit earlier that I worked in Japan for a number of years. NTT Communications or NTT in general, is one of the largest employers in Japan. And they always had a rule that you had to work within a certain radius of the city of Tokyo and their actual locations if you were going to work for them. Because of COVID, that rule has now been taken away. So you can imagine what that's done for the workforce. It's really enabled a much stronger population of people, whether it be male, female, to be able to now work for a very prestigious company without having to worry about the cost of living of the city, which, in Tokyo is just as expensive as living in San Francisco or LA. And I think it kind of comes back to some of the reasons why you didn't see as many women in the workforce in the past as you do now. If you think about where was tech centered, tech was centered often in Silicon Valley, very, very expensive place to work. And it just wasn't accessible by families. And therefore, in the earlier days, women to raise a family there and be able to invest both in their personal career as well as any other things that they needed to do. So there's been a lot of change, but I definitely was very lucky to have my husband be so willing, right, to take that step of staying home and taking care of my children in those early days. Now it's probably much more common, but those are the kinds of, it's really cultural changes and cultural adoption that I think have changed the nature of how women have been able not just to work in the tech space, but to succeed in the tech space. Because to succeed, you really have to dedicate yourself. And when you dedicate yourself to a tech career, it probably means you're making, you're either giving something up or you're prioritizing certain things over others. And now with the ability to be, work from anywhere pretty much, that's a lot easier to do.
Yes, because actually I spoke to a lady recently who she transitioned from a career as an academic into technology, and she retrained whilst on maternity leave because it dawned on her that if you're a teacher, you physically need to be present. And she said, at that point, she'd had a lot of children by that point, and she started to rethink, what do I want to do? Where do I need to be in the day? And she said, technology just seemed, like a no-brainer for her. That you don't have to be present. She's continually learning. She said that the wages are good. So yes, absolutely, those cultural changes. I think she even she was saying when she had her first child, I think she said 18 years ago, she said, I never would have imagined that I could have such a flexible role where I can work from home and juggle everything that she needs to do as a working mum. We've mentioned a lot about ladies going into tech, and obviously the benefits of that. What more should be done to increase the number of women in leadership roles? I mean, that's one thing to get women into the tech sector, but how do we ensure that they're moved up into those leadership positions where they can really bring about change?
I think there's a couple things. The first one I will always talk about is mentoring programs, because I do believe that talent is often hidden kind of in the ranks. And if you have mentorship programs, the first thing you'll do is be able to find the people that truly do have the talent to rise up. The other is, and we have this in SS&C Blue Prism, it's called Women in RPA. And it's an association that goes beyond our walls, where we actually encourage women that are in the industry, in the intelligent automation industry, to join together and learn from each other as to how they can become what I call the heroes in their business. Automation is a field that often is best understood in some ways. The process side of what then can be automated is best understood by the people that really know those processes the best. And what I found working in this specific field for the last 5 years is they are often women. Women are very good at process, and they often really are the ones that at the end of the day know most, as I said earlier, about how the processes in a company work and what needs to be done to fix them. That said, they weren't often the people that were given the opportunity to do that. When RPA came about, what we found is those women also had less risk. They said, look, I've been working on this process, whatever it is, or I have a team of people that do this. I know where the problems are. I know it can be fixed. They took the initiative to learn, this new technology that just didn't exist before. They built teams and they became heroes in their business for doing that. And I have a story about a lady that I was presenting with at an AI conference. And she was from a bank up in Canada. And she, when she showed me her slides, every slide had two halves to the slide. On the right-hand side was a very, fancy PowerPoint, what you typically see on a conference stage. And on the other side, it was stick figures. And I asked her, I said, this is quite different, quite unique. Why did you create your slides this way? She said, well, she said, the person on the right that, created the right side of the slide that was very, uniquely PowerPointed. That's who I need to be as I stand up in front of this audience and who I've become. The person on the other side, the stick figure side, is who I always saw myself as. So it just shows the power of what is possible when women really know what they do best, but are also willing to take a risk. They're willing to take a risk in trying something new, to leading that effort in their company, and then being willing to stand up on stage in this case, and show what's possible to others. And I can absolutely promise you that there were other women in that audience, and just probably other people in general, that could relate to that story, that could see, I see that beautiful PowerPoint. I don't see myself in that way. I see myself in the stick figure way, but here's somebody that truly made it possible to go from one to the other, and to really increase, who she was as a career leader now, not so much a career worker. So I think it's seeing yourself in other people. It's finding those role models, but then it's incumbent upon the company themselves to have these formal programs that draw out these people that have the initiative, have the capability, and maybe aren't as aggressive in showing that. But once you draw it out from them in some way, like they did with this woman, they become who they can be. And so those are the kinds of things that I try now to emulate from people I've worked for in the past, and or people I've just seen become successful. What is it that enabled them to achieve that success? And how do I help other younger women now in our business achieve that as well?
Yes, absolutely. And that is as well actually leads nicely onto what I wanted to ask you next about, women aren't the only underrepresented group in tech. And, I want to talk a little bit about what more can be done to make, tech more diverse across race, class, and gender. Is that a bias problem, do we think? I mean, obviously, you mentioned ladies there and ensuring that, people do what they can to draw out people's skills, to make sure that they're the best that they can be. But what happens, if there's a bias problem there, and people don't always get that chance?
There can be, and I know when we say bias, of course, most of us say, well, we don't have that, right?
Yeah.
It's that unconscious bias that is typically the cause. But what we've done in our company, and I think it's probably pretty relevant in others as well, is, you really have to first and foremost get people to understand the unconscious bias. It's not what you say, not what you do, but it's there. And once they understand that, then they do tend to, and even my personal self, I think about it more, in this instance of whatever decision I'm making, whatever recommendation I'm making, am I looking broadly enough? And the reason that's so important, and it does start with your hiring practices, it absolutely does start with hiring practices. Are you looking broadly enough within the ecosystem of people that you can hire from? Are you promoting broadly enough within the ecosystem of people that you can promote from? And so I think that's the first step, is really looking at the criteria of what you're trying to achieve and making sure you're bringing the right set of people to the table, right, to achieve that on your behalf. The other thing, though, I'll say is I think it's become more and more important. And this is where the tech sector is continuing to evolve. If you think about decision making now for the customers that you serve, for the prospects that you want to appeal to, you have to have people in your company and in your leadership team that represent the sectors that you're selling to, servicing, trying to recruit as customers. Because if you don't, then you won't appeal to the broad audience and or commercial market that you want to appeal to. And I think that's one of the things that we should be talking more about. How do you make sure that you have people that your customer base see as themselves? And if we start speaking about it from that perspective, then companies, people in decision-making power at companies, they'll make the right decisions, right? Because that's what business is all about. Business is all about appealing to your audience. And so as you look at a more diverse audience, then you're going to want to hire a more diverse set of people to represent that audience. And I'll give you another example, and this is, again, many years ago, but I spent a lot of years in the contact center space. And, if you remember back years ago, or ATMs, any sort of tech like that, you walked up to an ATM and it was English. You called into a contact center, it was English. And I would say the first major change that we saw in the US was when you dialed into a contact center automated system, and it said, press 1 for Spanish, press 2 for English. And I know it sounds like a very basic thing, but that was the company appealing to its audience.
Yes.
The demographics in the US had shifted, especially down, in the Southwest area, maybe in the Northeast area. When the demographics shifted, companies had to start to both hire people that would appeal to that demographic, but also in specifically in the technology, they had to adapt their technology to the audiences that were either the customers they had or the prospects that they were trying to recruit. And and I think those are some major things that you see these shifts, and the companies that do them the fastest, those that are first to the table, right, to make those kinds of changes, are the ones that then are perceived by the customers or prospects they're trying to gain as the most like them, right? They're appealing to their audience, and the audience sees that. So there's where I think you're going to see a lot of shifts as demographics change, whether it be US, UK, it doesn't matter. And companies are first to the table to start to make those changes, and you have fast followers after that. We see the same in technologies like AI, where you don't automation is really good because automation is fair, right? Automation is done via a set of rules, right? If you can put the rules down, then you can automate it. That's what we always say. And it doesn't have bias, right? It's a set of rules, and those rules, and those, we call them digital workers, robots, whatever you want to call them. They don't know who's on the other end, right? So there can be no bias. But when you get into AI and decision making, right? So now your rules aren't just black and white, step 1, step 2. It's actually using information, and we call it training, but AI is trained by how people respond to it. And you can adjust those rules based on how you want the outcome to be. And there's another reason why it's so important to have a diverse workforce, because once again, are you training the AI based on your perceived values or your perceived what's right or wrong or what should or should not happen? And or are you doing that on the basis of the customer base, or I call them the audience that you have? And if you have a diverse set of people that represent that customer base or prospect base, then you'll be making the decisions, and you'll be training the AI to work in such a way that it gets to the right answer for the audience that you're serving. So there's a couple different examples there, some very basic, press 1, press 2, and then how has that technology evolved over time into more decision making now tech that really both kind of look at the audience that you're trying to serve, and then suggest that you have people within your business that represent that audience.
Yes, I absolutely agree, because if you, to be honest, when I started in work, I like a lot of young people at the time, I really struggled to get on an editorial team. And I remember going for lots of interviews. It takes a little while, obviously, to have some interview practice. But I remember when I did finally get my first job, My boss later, she said to me at a Christmas party, I hired you because you reminded me of me when I was young. And at first was alarming because she had had quite a few to drink at the Christmas party, but also I did think actually people, they do hire what they know. And if anybody listening as well, if you were to look back on the hires that you've made in the past, do a lot of them remind you of yourself, which is, as you say, doesn't always reflect your customer base and actually the people that you need to hire to make a success of that business.
Exactly.
Yes, and I think it's once people, I think, they've had the mirror held up to them, I think that they realize, actually I didn't quite realize I was hiring people that remind me of myself. And with ladies in tech, if you're always going to a male interview panel and there's nobody there that can relate to you and nobody that thinks, I know what I'm going to get from this lady because she reminds me of me, then obviously it becomes quite a challenge to secure a role as a women in tech, even if you do get an interview. Is there any advice that you would pass on to other women to help them progress in the industry? Any advice that you've heard yourself that you would like to pass on?
Well, I'm going to start with some advice for people that aren't in the industry yet. And this is the same advice I gave my two daughters. I strongly suggested, because you can only strongly suggest to 18-year-old daughters, that they attend what are called in the US co-op schools, and or colleges that have strong internship programs. And the reason for that is in a co-op school, and there's only maybe 8 of them here in the US, you have 3 jobs, sometime paid for, sometime not paid for, before you graduate college. So you go to school for about 1.5 years, and then you work for 6 months, and then you go back to school, and then you work again, and you go on and off until you finish the program. And it was so important because they learned how to act, how to be a part of a team, how to contribute to the success of a business, how to see things that were not so easy to understand in business. One of my daughters was at a company that had a big layoff while she was there. And you can imagine the first time you see that, it's shocking. But if you're seeing it when you're in a 6-month program versus you're seeing it, once you've joined a company, it's a very different perspective.
Yeah.
One of my daughters said to me, because they have to interview for these positions, and so you have to learn how to interview, for real, because you're either going to get the position or not as a co-op student. And she said, "Mom, this is ridiculous." She said, "Every interview I do is different. How do I learn?" And I said, "That's the point." Right. And
Yes.
But in her mind, right, she would get better if they were continuously the same, so she could learn how to do it. Right. But it was just these stories that, they really were able to gain not the experience as much as the confidence to be in the workforce.
Yeah.
And so for very young people, if you're going to any sort of college, university in the UK, look for opportunities when it's a very low risk time in your life to be in a workforce and to be able to experience working with people that are of all different ages, all different backgrounds, right? And learn how to work with people. Because
it's so
I think
important now, because working from home, you might not have that interaction with people in the workplace, and how much harder that is for younger people nowadays to gain that experience.
It is. And if you think about, in some ways, technology hasn't helped us at all in this area. I can, as a younger person, as an older person, it doesn't matter. I can typically interact with any business I want without ever having to talk to a person.
Yes.
When we were younger, or when I was younger, I should say, you had to interact with people because that's the only way you got things done. You walked into a bank, right? You interacted with people. It didn't matter what you were trying to do. Now I can do everything online. I never have to interact with a person. How do I really learn that skill? And, you know, I learned how to interact with my peers through school and things like that, programs I'm in. But when you go to work, you have to interact with people at all different ages. You have to have confidence in yourself and confidence in how you get things done, using the talents of others. So I think that's my advice for the younger generation. For people that are in the workforce today, it really does get back to continuously, especially in tech, continuously developing your skills. Your story about the woman that was an educator and then moved into the tech industry, you know, she was so happy because she could keep learning new things. It's not about being happy doing that. It's an absolute necessity. That, you know, tech changes so quickly that if you're not looking at the next evolutions in whatever field you're in, you will be behind. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important, is to always spend time investing in your career. And when I say that, I mean investing in the technology aspects of the part of the tech field that you're in. Second one is networking. There's so many programs now, and I'm sure you have the same in the UK and the US. We have a women's networking program called Chief. You know, there's programs you can join to really network with other women. And then, you know, same if you're in, you know, a small town and they have a Rotary Club, or it doesn't matter what it is, but it's getting into opportunities where you're meeting people that do things beyond what you do, that work in companies outside of the company you work with, because you never know. Like if you look at tech right now, there's a couple of companies in the US, you know, big layoffs occurring. For the people that have strong networks, LinkedIn, you know, it sounds very simple, but if you have a good LinkedIn network, the opportunities to move to a field that's either adjacent to what you're doing today in tech, or to, you know, moving to maybe in the very same field, it might be one of your competitors, right, that now you're going to go work for. But the opportunity of getting those jobs when you know people because you've maintained and grown your network is really critical. So I think, you know, we can get caught up in the day-to-day aspects of our work, and you get very busy with that. And obviously you have your personal life that you need to take care of as well. But you need to take out some time every day, every week, to ensure that you're constantly building that network and staying committed to the people that you knew before. You know, many of us came from companies, and I've probably worked for 4 or 5 now, that, you know, the people that you knew at that company, very strong people, have gone other places. So making sure you're keeping up with those relationships will pay off, because the evolution of tech is fast, and you need to be always ready to take on the next position in your own company, you know, as you possibly can. But as importantly, be ready to apply yourself to opportunities at companies beyond where you work today.
Yeah, that's some great advice there, and also a great place to end it, because unfortunately we are out of time. It's gone incredibly fast, so thank you, Linda, for talking to us today and sharing your insights, because that was a really interesting conversation. I very nearly lost track of time. And to everybody listening, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time.